Great. Okay, so we have finished in the book of Judges, where we've had that lovely story about Ehud ben Gera, the assassin, and we had the very good story from a feminist point of view of the women who take over, Devorah and Yael. And if you come a little closer, then we can. And a bunch of other stuff in between. I'm just reminding everyone that Book of Judges is a series of tales that we will see today that have been woven together by the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic editor with a particular theology, ideology in mind of reward and punishment, theology of a reward and punishment. We'll see an important section about that today. And there's always that framing of, well, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and God opened the way up for the enemy to make their lives miserable. And then they cried out, and a savior savior rose, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a complex beginning here of this particular story. There's a lot of background information, and perhaps I'll have something to say about why there's so much background, more than the other stories, as to the enemy and what the circumstances were. Before we go on, are there any questions that people had about the previous sessions? I know we had a break now of 2 weeks, or 3 weeks. I don't even remember how long the break's been. But did anybody want to say anything until now about?
I would.
Sure.
I would just say that what I remember and what stayed with me, my takeaway from the previous lessons, were the poetry that was involved in telling the stories. When things would be repeated to make emphasis, but the way it was done. And now again, remember, I'm reading in translation, but still the poetry was very, very clear and beautiful.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Alan. So there's poetry and there's poetic prose. So I think you're referring to both, not just that poem that we had in the 5th chapter of Judges, but also the way the narrative prose is very poetic in its style. So there's two things that can help one, a student of, a modern student of Bible, of Hebrew Bible, who doesn't read the Hebrew so fluently, two things that are important tools. One is Robert Alter's translation. For those that don't have it and can afford a little bit, that's always a good translation to have, because he himself is a person of literature. He's a writer, very, very sensitive, and a very good Hebrew, of course, in his translations, and will often translate in less literal and more poetic, if I might say that. And so, and that there's an edition. I don't have it because I have a piecemeal that I bought over the years. Although I don't think I have Judges. I have Samuel, but I don't think I have Judges. But I think in the last few years, a beautiful edition was published, and it's really worthwhile. The other thing is also by Robert Alter. Not the only book, but his is maybe the most accessible that I know about the art of biblical literature. I originally published The Art of Biblical Narrative, and then The Art of Biblical Poetry, and then another edition came out with both of those things together. He was my first teacher, even before I started studying Bible. I would say that's the reason that he's the reason why I chose to take courses in the Bible department in 1982 when I began my university studies at age 25 with one child and one child on the way. So I say that because what I did, everything I did, I had to make it count. There was no just kind of floating around courses the way that an 18, 19-year-old might do. In a liberal arts college, I had to be very, very focused. And Alter, although he taught in Berkeley, and I read him in English, he kind of put me on the way. And that's why I hooked up with Yair Zakovich as well, who of course taught me far more because I studied with him over the years. And for those that didn't catch the news item when it happened a few months ago when it was announced, he's been chosen to receive the Israel Prize on Yom Ha'atzmaut and the Israel Independence Day, and we're all very excited about that. Okay, anything else before we jump into chapter 6?
I'm just very glad you shared about Alter, because I recently, because I'm taking this class, bought his 3-volume set. I have found him so easy to understand, so easy to help my thoughts go the right places.
Great, wonderful.
And I didn't have brains enough to know which one to pick, so thank you.
Okay.
I just got a lucky break.
All right, and I'll repeat that the text that's on our pages is almost always the New Jewish Publication Society. It's not a question of what's the best. It's very, it happens to be the one that's on Safaria, so it comes up. I don't have to type in text. It's easily accessible. Alter, you may get a piece here and there that's digital online, but not the whole thing. And also there's something to be said for a more academic text that was researched by a committee of scholars and not up to one person. It's all important. What is important, though, is that the text be based on scholarship. That's the difference between texts that are designed for liturgy or for public consumption, which you have not only in the Christian world, but also in the Jewish world. There's something called the Jerusalem Bible, which is a usage of a name, which is the original Jerusalem Bible is a product of the French, a French Catholic institution in Jerusalem, École Biblique, the study of Bible, the Bible Institute of Bible Studies in Eastern Jerusalem. And it was under their tutelage, I believe, the Jerusalem Bible. It was the translation into French, and then that was translated into English. So you do find sometimes in bookstores the Jerusalem Bible's large volume, but you find in Jewish, especially Orthodox bookstores, a stouter volume called the Jerusalem Bible, which is, I'm not really sure, I don't think a person takes credit for it, but it's an Orthodox publication, which stands out in that it is attuned, say, to Rashi's interpretations of the Torah, as opposed to more difficult texts. And the way to see it always is that all the names have been transliterated. So if we're going to see Gideon in our text, it'll probably say there Gideon, G-I-D-O-N. And again, all of them are possible, but that was created for the consumption of Orthodox Jews or Orthodox rabbis that wanted. And of course, the Art Scroll is even more so with interpretation. Okay, so why don't we jump into Judges 6, and before we actually meet Gideon, there's a long introduction. So Michael, are you up to reading 1 to 6?
Sure. Welcome back.
Thank you.
When then the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Midianites for 7 years. The hand of the Midianites prevailed over Israel, and because of Midian, the Israelites provided themselves with refuges in the caves and strongholds of the mountains. After the Israelites had done their sowing, Midian, Amalek, and the Kendamites would come up and raid them. They would attack them, to destroy the produce of the land all the way to Gaza, and leave no means of sustenance in Israel, not a sheep or an ox or an ass. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, swarming as thick as locusts. They and their camels were innumerable. Thus they would invade the land and ravage it. Israel was reduced to utter misery by the Midianites, and the Israelites cried out to the Lord.
Okay, so sound familiar, anybody, from almost every war that has ever happened on this earth? Of this kind of this is not a scorched earth policy. That's the kind of a special thing. I don't know the history of that exactly, but that's just out of spite. This is more like civil war and that kind of stuff, or whatever, taking over people's crops it's a form of looting, right? It's looting the enemy, but it's a very detailed description here of, it's not only them coming in and driving off with carts of their grain, but it's also bringing their animals in to overgraze. I added the over there, and it's not just here and there. The narrator gives the impression that it's the entire land all the way to the sea, he would say, but he doesn't say the sea because Gaza, that is the strip there with the Philistines, gets in the way. So until Gaza, and nobody dared go into Gaza, right? But it does orient us into the southern part of the promised land, as opposed to the northern part that we talked about in the last story, where those tribes were further north. we haven't yet heard the tribes, but it's already foreshadowing the area of the war that's going to take place, or at least the center, where the central character is. Now, somebody is bound to ask, of course, I'll ask it for you, what the Midians, right? The Midianites, just yesterday, we had the passage in Numbers about Chovav, the son of Ruel, Chotain or Chatan, depending on the vowels that you use, Moshe, either the brother-in-law or the father-in-law of Moses, who Moses asked to be their eyes in the desert, to lead them around, and he's a Midianite according to that story. And Moses hung out with the Midianites, right? And Jethro was a Kohen Midian, a priest of the Midianites. So there they turn out really good. There seems to be a connection with the previous story where Yael is part of the Chever HaKini. The Kenites and the Midianites are related. They stem from Avram, right? They're part of that, the Abramic family. Yet on the other hand, we have them popping up from time to time as thorns in the sides of Israel. Here they appear together with, not here, the only place, but with the Amalekites. And so while some people, many of the traditional critical commentaries, say traditional, I mean in the world of academia from the 19th century onwards, they talk a lot about where, how could this be if the Midianites were further south? And although there's no consensus, it seems to be, and that's how I learned it, and even the cursory reading of the various commentaries I did today, somebody says we shouldn't call them Bedouin because that's its own category. Like we need to be careful with names here, Native American, Indian, but they're nomadic. They were nomadic, and many people point to the camels here as being a sign of their nomadicism, if there is a word like that, of their nomadic lifestyle. And the camels seem to be emphasized here. The camels were innumerable and swarming thick as locusts. And of course, at the basis of this is this agricultural challenge. We're going to get back to that. The theme of agriculture, which didn't come up in the previous stories. It could have been there, but that's not how the narrator chose to tell the story. Here, already in the foundation, in the background for the story, agriculture is, and the tension around that, the stress around that is in a key position. And finally, before I'll take questions, there's this really interesting word on the second line in the Hebrew, the minharot. Now, anybody who knows modern Hebrew knows that a minhara is a tunnel, like the minharat hakotel, those tunnels next to the Western Wall, or anybody in modern Hebrew, minhara. And it probably comes, I think it comes from the root nahar, which is river. So it probably comes from a canal, which is dug, and that semantically goes into a tunnel, which is dug, or a cave or a recess that has been created for refuge. It's an interesting word because it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So it's a hapax legomena. It's a one-time.
Wait a minute.
What's that?
Isn't Nara a cave?
Well, no. A me'ara is a cave with an ayin, and here it's translated with refuge, with refuges in the caves. That's a translation of the idiom, an idiomatic translation. It's not a literal translation. Haminarot asher beharim, which we would say maybe the dugout caves in the mountains. But another word for cave is me'ara. It just means that it could be the difference between a natural one or a dugout one, or it could just be just two words for the same thing. Okay, any comments or questions? Yes, Harold. Can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay, who are the Kendamites?
The word is our Easterners, right? Kedem is Eastern. The word Kedem means east, but it also means beforehand because the sun comes up beforehand. So I don't have any other information on it. My guess, so I don't even know if they don't appear anywhere else. But you are right in that they're not the They're not the seven usual culprits that we talk about of the Canaanites, neither the Midianites. So it could be that they're also some sort of a nomadic people, marauders.
Okay.
Marauders, we would call them. Yeah, I don't know, but the real answer is I don't know.
Okay.
Who else? Okay. All right. Yeah. So why don't we go on? Alan, would you read 7 to 10?
When the Israelites cried to the Lord on account of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites who said to them, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought you up out of Egypt and freed you from the house of bondage. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all of your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I, the Lord, am your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you did not obey me."
Okay, so the commentators point out that this is classic Deuteronomic language of the book of Deuteronomy. You'll notice there's really no connection to what we read beforehand. I mean, in theme, I guess you could say it, but it's kind of a rallying cry, but it does justify why these bad things are happening to otherwise perhaps good people. They may think they're good, and it's happening because they're just not listening. They're not doing by the book. So many of the modern commentaries feel that this paragraph has been parachuted in here, from another place. Yeah, so therefore it's kind of hard to comment on it, but this would definitely be part of the editorial framework of these stories we're reading. Any comments?
Name of the prophet is not specified. He's anonymous.
Right. So the rabbis of the Talmud, of course, I've said before, don't like anonymity. So do you know who they assign this to, Dan?
No, I don't.
So Pinchas ben Elazar the Kohen, and he's assigned to a number of roles in the first part of Judges, and one might say that's their need to fill the vacuum. How can there be an anonymous? But the fact that the prophet is anonymous is what some of the scholars say shows that it may be a foreign object, if you will, in this narration that we have here, but it's an ancient one, because if it wasn't, no longer, the name is no longer remembered of who it is. It's interesting, the siruf, the coupling of words, ish navi, is nowhere else to be found. A man, a prophet. We do have isha neviah. Where do we have isha neviah? With what?
Dvorah.
Exactly. Dvorah was isha neviah, and that may be the style of the overall, again, of the traditions in Judges, but that particular formula doesn't appear. Ish navi. Somebody asked, and Ella, you'll appreciate, the others of you who know Hebrew language here. One of my colleagues on one of the lists said that she saw an interpretation in a book of comparing Judaism and Islam, that the word navi for prophet comes from the expression niv sfatayim. Niv sfatayim is literally the fruit of the lips, and that's from a verse in Isaiah. And whereas navi comes from the root nun bet aleph, that means to prophesy. Niv comes from nun vav bet, which means fruit, has to do with giving fruit. And it's nice. It's a nice midrash, but it's not semantic. It's not the academic etymology. And somebody found, she wanted to know what a source for that was, and somebody found it in Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, who came up with that lovely interpretation that a navi, prophet, is one who brings the fruit of God's words to the people. It's a lovely idea, I think, right? In general, to think of our words as fruit of our mouth perhaps if we have more intentionality on that, we'll be careful what comes out of our mouth, as opposed to the garbage of our mouth, or something like that. Okay. Anything else? But good, thanks, Dan, for pointing that out. Anything else? Okay. All right, then. Trudy, would you read 11:13?
Sure. An angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Bezerite. His son Gideon was then beating out wheat inside a wine press in order to keep it safe from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior." Gideon said to him, "Please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all of this befallen us? Where are all his wondrous deeds about which our fathers told us, saying, 'Truly, the Lord brought us up from Egypt'? Now the Lord has abandoned us and delivered us into the hands of Midian."
So this goes under today's category of heard that before, right? In every catastrophe, why? And, people are asking it now because of this year we've had. People are always in a communal sense, people are always asking it in a particular sense about sickness and tragedy. And why do bad things happen to good people, etc. And so here we're introduced to this young farmer, Gideon, whose father's name is here, but we don't hear much about him. From another place, Joash, and he's an Aviezerite, meaning that's the clan that he's part of, Aviezer, of the clan of Menashe. Menashe being part of the Joseph tribe, Menashe and Ephraim. Always keep in the mind when there's talk about Ephraim or Menashe, there's a possibility of that having something to do with the northern kingdom, with the competition for leadership of the ancient tribes of Israel between Judah and the tribes of and the two tribes of Joseph. Okay, and
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
But in some of the previous chapters that we read, I think the first one or the second, the Israelites actually sinned to God and they followed idols, etc., etc. So that is the reason given for all the tzarot, all the troubles that they were having now.
You're right. So you're conditioned, Ella, from reading of Judges. You could say we know this thing already, but you'll notice that this story, the beginning of this story, is far more complex and detailed than the beginnings of the other stories, which were the people sinned, they cried out to God, God sent a savior. This one is far more detailed. Must have been some kind of focus on Gideon more than the others, in the same way that Samson gets far more attention. And we'll have to talk about that perhaps when we finish. We're only beginning the Gideon stories today. But yes, you are right. It seems plausible to think that way, yet the text doesn't say it explicitly. What does the text do instead? It parachutes this paragraph we had beforehand from 7 to 10, which kind of says, oh yeah, of course. Well, they were suffering now because they didn't play by the rules. So that might explain why a later editor felt the need to insert that passage 7 to 10. So who appears to Gideon?
An angel.
Right. So we don't know who. Right. Angels are anonymous, but it's clear from the text that it says, right, Vayavo malach Adonai, malach meaning angel or messenger, right? Messenger, which angel means, of course. And we'll have a lot more to say about that. The last thing is this Allah, this terebinth, which is I forgot what kind of a tree it is,
Pistachio.
Yeah, they say pistachio, but I have a feeling it's more like an oak kind of a tree. But but it's an important tree, very often having to do with idolatry, right? Places are named Allah or Alon. They're very similar, Allah and Alon, like Alon in the Abraham stories. And so there's something already reminiscent, I feel, of the Abraham story here, of the tree and of an angel coming. But just before we go on to that, where is this happening?
On their property.
Identified as Ophrah.
Ophrah.
So it's at a place called Ophrah. And where in Ophrah is it happening?
Under the terebinth.
Right, but what's the background? Well, his son Gideon was then beating out wheat inside of a
wine press.
right? In a wine press. Why in a wine? Why was he beating out wheat in a wine press?
I assume it was inside to keep it safe.
Or to hide, because nobody expected to be. You don't expect when the marauders come, they look in the where you beat the threshing floor. They don't look in the wine press. But this to me is another is this leitmotif of agriculture that's in it. In other words, they took a man who was a simple farmer, and he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's trying to survive. He must be smart because he's gone from the obvious place to another place where they wouldn't expect to look. And then this angel appears to him and says to him, the Lord is with you, you valiant warrior. We haven't heard anything about him before being a warrior. We don't know if he was just being a farmer as well. He was a farmer and a warrior. But remember how I introduced this course and said that I always want to try to go back to what this has to do with modern day Israel, Zionism and Israel. Think of the mythology of the Israeli mythology of the late 19th, early of the 20th century, of the kibbutznik, who is both a farmer and a valiant warrior, very much in the background. They're very smart, surviving, and it reflects. It's not that it didn't reflect a reality, right? The Jews that came to Palestine in the late 19th century, before statehood, and even in the first decade or two of statehood, were constantly doing things. What's the expression when you can't do something the regular way, so you find a workaround, a hack. That's what people say. They're always hacking. They found a hack, and so I think let's keep this in mind, that there are these marauders. They're out to destroy us. You may know this constant complaint, whether it's historically true or not. Even if it is historically true, it's still something that's emphasized a lot in the story of the early Zionists, the founders of the state of Israel, talking about the culture of people that were there beforehand. Ella, you've brought this up before, right? The fact that herds of goats and sheep had kind of decimated the greenery of the land of Israel over centuries. Again, whether this is true or not true, and I don't know, but even if it is true, it's emphasized. If it's not true, it's a little bit sinister, of course, but if it's true, it's emphasized a lot in the story. And yet the modern day Israelis come and they reforest the land. They build back up the land. Again, could be very much true, but that's part of the story. And I really believe that in the background of how early Israelis or pre-Israelis presented themselves, there was the kind of description we have here of Gideon. Reactions, questions?
David, is that why Gideon was like a very favored name among Chalutzim?
I think so.
It's not a traditional Jewish name.
Right.
I mean, it is, but it's not.
No, it's not. I don't, Scotty, I don't think I can remember. Certainly none of the rabbis of the Talmud period.
Right, yeah.
Or authors, there's no,
Right.
Moreno Harav Gideon ben Shmuel, right? It's other names. So Gideon is not a role model, so to speak, in classical traditional Judaism. And that again is part of that resurrection or that reclaiming of ancient Jewish history that began to happen in the late 19th century that I spoke about before, when it comes to the apocryphal literature, the books of Maccabees, the idea of soldiers, of Jewish soldiers, priestly soldiers that can, that was instilled in me as a Hesder yeshiva boy, that we served in the army and also in yeshiva at the same time, you know, a gun in one hand, our Bibles in the other hand, that kind of symbolism. Yeah, so Gideon is one of those names, right? Very much so.
Kibbutz. Gideon.
Yeah. And in general, all of us probably know an Israeli whose name is Gideon. Tagili Gideon, Manishma Gideon, right? Gideon. Okay. All right. So we also know of Gideon, and we'll get to that. I promise. Needed to have a good hook for today. We'll get to Gideon in his Bibles towards the end. Yes, Ella.
Just a point of information about goats. I think in the 50s or so, the kibbutzim were not allowed to raise goats because goats were destructive to the land.
Could be. I
Mhm.
don't know. You know that there's a law in the books of State of Israel that you're not allowed to raise pigs. Did you know that?
They built a risen 2 feet, a foot and a half off the ground. It's a platform. The pigs are on there, so therefore they're not on the ground of Eretz Israel.
Which is, Alan, I'm very impressed that you know that. That's Kibbutz Mizra is famous for their pork products. And in Hebrew, you don't eat chazir in modern Hebrew, not so much anymore. You eat basar lavan, white meat, which the euphemism for. But Alan, that's impressive. You know that. I didn't know if it's a foot and a half or whatever, but that's a typical Talmudic solution to a problem, right?
Right.
You have a sukkah. You have a sukkah where the schach, the ceiling is far ahead. You can't afford, you don't have materials to build a whole wall. All you need to do is to build 10 handbreadths up right under it, and that counts as a wall, or the fictitious wall of the eruv, the wire that goes around the city. Typical rabbinic logic used, kind of against the rabbis themselves in Israel. Okay, so speaking of which, I don't know what on the books there are laws of selling and displaying chametz on Pesach, right? I think it's ignored a lot in Tel Aviv, a place like Tel Aviv, but you're not allowed to, like a bakery. Let's say a bakery just wants to be open, and I think there's a dispensation for non-Jewish bakers, but I'm not sure how that works exactly. That's one of the things. There's a lot of laws like that in the modern state of Israel that are very much according to halakha, even if the people don't necessarily keep it themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on this rich section we just did? Okay, John, how about carrying on now? Let's see what happens. This interaction between Gideon and the angel. Go ahead.
Am I the only John?
Yes, John, I think so. Go ahead.
It's such a, thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Yes, the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this strength of yours and deliver Israel from the Midianites. I herewith make you my messenger." He said to him, "Please, my Lord, how can I deliver Israel? Why, my clan is the humblest in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's household." The Lord replied, "I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian to a man." And he said to him, "If I have gained your favor, give me a sign that it is you who are speaking to me. Do not leave this place until I come back to you and bring out my offering and place it before you." And he answered, "I will stay until you return."
Okay. So does Gideon know who he's talking to?
Putting a test to try and verify it, seems like it.
So we have in the English reflecting, there's one problem with translation we'll get to in a second, but right, we know that it was an angel from the previous section. Now it says the Lord turned to him saying, "Vayfen elav Adonai." Remind you of anything? The angel speaks, and in the same story, suddenly the angel becomes God.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Before in Judges.
The same thing happens with Abraham and the three angels.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of that narrative, suddenly the narrator doesn't even say angels, and God spoke to him. Now, what does Abraham see? I think that's part of the art of the narrative here, is that it's confusing. When Josephus writes about our whole thing, he talks about it as a dream. That's not presented here as a dream. Maimonides will say afterwards in Guide for the Perplexed, it was only Abraham It was only Moses who got to speak with God face to face. Even Abraham, and all the more so the others, they only saw God in a dream. But here it's presented as a story where a person comes to him. He's treating him like a person. And then when he says to him, I'm looking in the Hebrew for a second, if you could follow the Hebrew, it says, and God turned to him, Vayomer la, and in your strength go and save, be a savior, right? Becoming Halo shalachticha, and I've sent you. And that's a little bit of a play on the words of course, it's an angel in the beginning, somebody who was sent, a messenger comes to him, even though it's two words, malach and shaliach, but that's part of the poetry here. You be my, in other words, now I don't need a messenger to tell you that you're the messenger. You're going to be a messenger now. And what does he answer? Be, if you look towards the last part of that line, some texts have be, or the pointing here is be Adonai, be Adonai, but most probably it's be Adoni. What's the difference? Or even if it is, and the English reflects here, please sir, please my Lord, with a little L. Adoni is my Lord, Adonai is my God, or is God in general. And so that's kind of intentional. I think it's purposely left murky here. Gideon is slowly coming out of this naivete as to who he's talking to. But even if it is, if he still thinks it's a messenger, he still wants a sign. And you would think that it would be a little bit audacious of him to say to God, if he knew it was God, wait a minute, don't move, stay right there. So I'll be right back, and goes out and picks up the animals. Very reminiscent of Abraham, right? The whole story, I think, is very reminiscent of Abraham. In that story, you can go back and see that if you like afterwards. John, it looks like you want to say something.
If I had been in those sandals with things going through my mind, I would not want to make an offering, would I, to an angel?
So that's unclear.
If I didn't believe it was God.
Well, if you believed that he was a messenger of God,
okay,
it's unclear. In other words, we don't know the rules exactly of monotheism in his place at his time. It could reflect an earlier thing, and that was done, right? If sacrifices tributes to kings were made when their generals and their or their messengers came, it's kind of hard to know. But what I'm trying to say is that the paragraph remains rather fuzzy. It's not explicitly delineated exactly. And I think that's on purpose, because the encounter between human being and God is a tricky one. It's a complicated one. And I think that's what the narrative reflects.
Would some of the problem of understanding who you're speaking to be because I'm looking at what appears to be a human, and that's not my concept of God?
Well, so that again, we don't know what their concept of God was, being that God has no form, right? So I don't think we could say that Gideon thought that maybe this man was God. I think that would be stretching it. I think many of the stories where there's a messenger, it's a person who represents God, and it could be just a regular person. There's no wings here, right? You'll see illustrations of this angel with wings, influenced by the Christian art history, but there's no wings here. He definitely sees a person. And slowly, I'll just say, slowly he comes to realize that he's talking to God, but not before what happens in the next paragraph. Okay, he says, "Wait here. Let me go and get the stuff." And he says, "I'll stay until you return." Okay. All right then. Eileen, would you like to read?
Sure. So Gideon went in and prepared a kid and baked unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and poured the broth into a pot, and he brought them out to him under the terebinth. As he presented them, the angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, put them on the yonder rock, and spill out the broth." He did so. The angel of the Lord held out the staff that he carried and touched the meat and the unleavened bread with its tip. A fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight.
It slowly becomes clear, but even in this paragraph, it's fuzzy, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to the angels, not God, and because God, there's a personification of God, kind of. But if it was God, and this I say mostly to John now, if Gideon had perceived this was God, then why would God need to touch?
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, it's messy here. It's not clear. I think on purpose. Some people like to see in this. Well, in general, I think everybody can kind of feel that this smacks of being a foundation story of a temple in Ophrah. And Ophrah, you should know, is one of the earliest of the settlements, post 1967 settlements, that's kind of north of Jerusalem. And this held, again, a special place for those that decided to settle there. There's a very detailed account of that settlement from 6 voices in Yossi Klein Halevi's As We Were as Dreamers. Really, really good book about the 6-day war, not told from a general's point of view or Yossi Klein Halevi, a friend of mine. He's a journalist, a well-respected journalist, but he spent years interviewing dozens of soldiers that were in the paratroopers unit that took the Temple Mount in the 6-day war. And in the end, he sifted it down to 6 different accounts. And because a number of them had were directly involved in the founding of Ophrah, whenever that was, in 68 probably, I'm guessing, there's really detailed accounts. And that was going up against the army, going up against the government, interesting times. But it's not by chance that Ophrah was there, because so that's for the Zionist point of this. But this is a foundation story of why there was a temple in Ophrah. Most scholars would say. Yechezkel Koifman, who is really one of the greatest, died relatively young, greatest Israeli Bible scholars, has a history of a theological history of Israel that's multi-volumes in Hebrew, was condensed to 1 volume by my teacher, Moshe Greenberg. Has a commentary to Joshua and Judges. It's an excellent, still today, it's from the 50s. It's an excellent commentary. And he was constantly polemicizing with German, even though he's critical, he wasn't religious, right? He's an academic scholar, but he's always polemicizing with the Wellhausen gang of German scholars who wanted to see in this particular place a foundation, including ritual of how do you found a new temple. And this is how you do it. You make the meat and you pour the gravy or the soup and all this kind of stuff. And he's very emphatic. No, this is not. This is just in order to set up this miracle, this sign, this wonder. And I think I tend to agree with him. Having the broth there is important, because if it's wet, it's harder to catch on fire. You can't just say it spontaneous combustion, right? Very similar to the story of Elijah and the prophets of the Baal on Mount Carmel, and with the water over it, right? To elevate the miracle even more so. And so a lovely kind of a thing. So a lovely kind of a test. You want to know if God's speaking to you? So this is what you do, right? You go inside, you get a few steaks out of the freezer and some broth from a box that you got at the supermarket, and you can get it done really quickly. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions about this? Okay. The angel, of course, disappears. Why?
It's done.
His job is done. An angel has a job, a message to carry. Once it's carried, so from this point onwards, now we know Gideon has direct contact with God, with Adonai.
Oh.
Pretty cool. All right. We have time to continue. So why don't we go on? Ella, would you like to read?
22, 24?
Yes, please.
Then Gideon realized that it was an angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen an angel of the Lord's face to face. But the Lord said to him, All is well, have no fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built there an altar to the Lord and called it Adonai Shalom. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Israelites.
Right. So that's the typical language of a foundation story of an theological tale of why something is, why something has a name, right? So Adonai Shalom. Shalom here is not peace, right? What does shalom here mean?
Whole.
Whole, exactly. Shalem, the root of it. And I didn't have time to go back and look because, of course, I scheduled a class a day after we got back and a day before Passover. But what I would look at here is the expression Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. Jacob, after all his trials and
Tribulations.
Thank you. The text in Genesis is Vayavo, and Jacob came back whole. And my guess is if we go back there, we'll find parallels to this this story. In general, the story is very much feels like a Genesis story, right? And between the terebinth and the agriculture and everything with it. Yeah. Okay.
I knew this story. I never learned this story.
Yeah, it's what they used to say, Sid, in the yeshiva world was, it wasn't really until I think Rabbi Cook was one of the first, if not the first, to introduce the study of Nach, of Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the non-Torah, the other 2/3 of the Hebrew Bible, into yeshiva studies. And I remember asking my Rebbe, Rabbi Spurka, in high school, why is it that we don't do that? Why? He said, because we expect you to learn the Haftarah, the additional reading every Shabbat, and you'll fill in the gaps. Now, it doesn't matter that the Haftarah would probably cover what, Dan, would you say, 2%? 3, if that, 1.5% of all the rest of the Bible, right? It's how many are there, right? There's, even if you take all the Sephardic, Ashkenazic, the holiday ones, how many are you going to get? 80? Let's say even 100. So 100 chapters. Just how about all the other parts, right?
Yeah.
And so it was Rav Kook, who, at least in Merkaz HaRav, they instituted Bible study, official classes in Bible study in Yeshiva Gvoa, that is post high school yeshiva. But in my own yeshiva, there was no classes. All the classes were in Talmud. Yeah.
Yeah, it was Talmud, and Talmud.
Right.
6-8 hours a day. And there was almost no time for English for our high school classes. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Madalena, would you read the next part, please? 25, 27.
Yes. That night the Lord said to him, Take the young bull belonging to your father and another bull 7 years old. Pull down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred post which is beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God on the level ground on top of this stronghold. Take the other bull and offer it as a burnt offering, using the wood of the sacred post that you have cut down. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But as he was afraid to do it by day, on account of his father's household and the townspeople, he did it by night.
Okay, and well, let's keep that in mind, that he started his career. Two things we know about him and his character, aside from questioning. One is that he found the workaround. He found the hack to thresh his grain in the wine press. And here he also kind of found a hack, right? Well, I can't do this in daylight, right? I got to do it in secret because of my family. Raises a lot of issues of when you do have someone, a new hero it's not an immediate thing. Even though the angel says you're a valiant soldier, right away, there's got to go through a process. And the first thing that God puts him through after giving him a sign, God giving Gideon a sign, is, okay, now you have to prove yourself to me, not as a warrior, but in a theological way. Got to do away with the idol worship. And not only do you do away with the idol worship by bringing in my worship, that is to God, you use their wood to make the fire. Right? Seems like a little stochner. Yeah.
Insult to injury, sort of.
Yeah, don't just throw it away. Which you could ask, what you know, later. I wouldn't be surprised if there's somebody in the Talmud who says, "Well, how could he use that wood for? You're not allowed to use things from idolatry in any way to derive benefit." I'm sure somebody's asked that question. I plead I'm guilty. I didn't figure. Whoever looks that up for next week gets a piece of the afikoman.
I mean,
Rabbi, can I ask you a question? Is this yet another parallel to Genesis with the story of Abraham at that point destroying his father's idols? Is that kind of also?
Yes, it definitely does. But I will remind you, David, which I think you know, it's actually not in Genesis.
Yeah.
We all think it's in Genesis. We all thought when we were kids, but as I pointed out,
then it's sort of it's I guess a midrash, but it's like
it's in the midrash.
It's one of those midrash that really should have been in the main story.
Right. That's like the person is, right. And even if the story didn't happen, it should have happened. Right. And so
I got a question.
What's that?
In the earlier part, he is doing the grain in the wine press.
Right.
Down here, he's got servants all of a sudden. What happened?
Okay, so there's two possible answers to that. One answer is that when you have the grain or when you have the whatever it is, it needs to be done as soon as possible. Think of Tolstoy, who is it in I think in Anna Karenina, the main guy is out there with his servants. He's reaping as well. You find that often. That's something that the landowner, the farmer, is very involved. Even if he does have servants, he's involved themselves, especially when it's something which is time sensitive, like a crop that needs to be done. That's one way to answer it. The other way, Bill, to answer is that a servant is doing not only the bidding, is the same in societies that have that tiered sociology. A servant does it in the name of his master, of her master. So you could understand it both ways. I prefer the first way because it reminds me of Boaz, right? In the book of Ruth, remember Boaz, he was sleeping in the threshing floor. That's where she met him. He could have had a guard. He could have hired a guard, right? He's kind of a wealthy landowner, but I choose to think of it as the distinction wasn't so, you can't get your hands dirty like a plantation owner in the South, as I imagine it, right?
Okay.
Good question. Yes, Michael.
So two things, Rabbi. So 10 of his servants, okay? This is, first of all, he took 10 of them, which means there's more than 10. And having 10 servants is, I assume this is not a poor person. And the second thing, I would imagine that his father is not going to be happy.
For a number of reasons, right? Not only because he's burning, he's destroying, he's ruining his reputation in the family, but also because of all these very expensive animals, right? These are animals that the public sacrifices, not so much individuals. An individual, you've got to be wealthy to give a young bull, or a number or two bulls, etc. Yeah. So yes, I mean, again, we this is the only material we have about Gideon, and perhaps that makes us, perhaps we can see even more impressive that he rose to the challenge and he'll do what he does in the chapters to come, because he was well-to-do and he was very bright. But in this Kulturkampf, right, this battle of cultures, there's a price to pay, and that's the social price he's got to pay, and hence the family price. Yes, Mariah.
kind of in line with what you were saying, I always thought that when they talk about servants in many of the old writings, that I picture them as workers. So not knowing how many, how much acreage Gideon has, maybe these are people who are working for him. So there's a difference in my mind between workers where you may, like you say, work alongside of them as a farmer, and people who might just wait on you hand and foot like royalty, just because you have wealth.
Right. So here it says, the Hebrew says, Vayikach Gidon asara anashim mi'avdav. He takes 10 men, 10 people from his servants. Now, you're right, servant, avdav are people, it's the same word in Hebrew, somebody who works, worships, serves, although that Eved can to be all of those, right? Eved Adonai is one who worships the Lord, or the servant of the Lord. So yeah, I think it's a fuzzy thing. We sometimes we project what we know from medieval stories or from movies or whatever it is. We project, and I think the best idea is to think of it as a
Pendulum?
Not a pendulum, a spectrum kind of. In other words,
Yeah,
defined categories. It's yeah, really depending on the situation. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So should we call it a day now, or should we finish what we have today?
Let's go on.
Okay, so I ask forgiveness for those that have to go.
How can you stop in the middle?
Oh,
Yeah.
Watch me, Sid. Okay, go ahead, Sid. Why don't you read? Go ahead. We're in the second page, 2832.
No, we're on the third page.
Sorry, that's what I meant. I mean the second piece of paper. Sorry. Third page.
I know.
Sid, 2832.
Oh, you want me to? Early the next morning, the townspeople found that the altar of Baal had been torn down, and the sacred post beside it had been cut down, and that the second bull had been offered on the newly built altar. They said to one another, "Who did this thing?" Upon inquiry and investigation, they were told, "Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing." The townspeople said to Joash, "Bring out your son, for he must die. He has torn down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred post beside it." But Joash said to all who had risen against him, "Do you have to contend for Baal? Do you have to vindicate him? Whoever fights his battle shall be dead by morning. If he is a god, let him fight his own battles, since it is his altar that has been torn down." That day they named him Jerubbaal. Is that meaning let Baal contend with him, since he tore down his altar?
Okay, so also coming to explain a number of things, but a dynamic. This really reminds us of that story, David, that you brought up, because Abraham smashes the idols, puts the stick in the hand of the biggest one who he didn't smash, and then when his father comes in, he says, "Well, I didn't do it, he did it." And his father says, "Well, how could he do it? He's stoned." Yeah, and so we can really see this is the background for that midrashic expansion of the Abraham story. But it also explains one of Gideon's names, which is Yeruval. So let's just take a step. We did talk about it before. I'll remind, the word Baal means master. And it's even used in modern Hebrew. Baalim in plural is the owner, even if it's one person, the owner of property, and also as husband. The word husband. I try not to use that word. I don't say ani baala shel Sasha, because the word husband also means master, right? But we don't hear it in the word husband as much as in Hebrew you can hear very easily Baal means to dominate. And so Baal is just another word a synonym for Adon. And so Adon, Adonai, Baal, Baalim, it could also mean, of course, a monotheism. It could have been a style, but but in the Hebrew Bible, the way we have it is Baal is one of the bad guys. Baal means the master of, and there was usually something with it, like Baal Zephon, the master of the north. But when we think in biblical terms of the Baal, we think in terms of the descriptions in Ugaritic ancient Canaanite literature of the god of thunder and lightning and fertility. Same all. And you may think of that little statue that we talk of sometimes of Baal with a pointed hat and a hole, right, with his arm raised and a hole where a thunderbolt went and broken off. And that's a popular, I mean, that's a common find, archaeological find from the Canaanite period. So Yeru means, at least in this context, in this midrash here, is the one who contends with Yerubal. We could have called Elijah Yerubal as well, right? The same name, but and we'll get this. There are other names in the Hebrew Bible that have they're theophoric names, right? That have name of God, but they have Baal in it. And so we have to ask who gave that name in what way, and we'll get to other names, maybe not here, but certainly in the book of Samuel, where Baal becomes Boshet. They play on words. Baal is an embarrassment, but anyway.
Baal Shem Tov.
Right, but that's different because it's usually say that's not biblical, right? That's of course a few hundred years ago, and he's the master, the owner of the good name.
Is that the same Yeru as for Yerushalayim?
I don't know. Okay, so go ahead, Ella. Why don't you read 33-35?
All Midian, Amalek, and the Kendamites joined forces. They crossed over and encamped in the valley of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord enveloped Gideon. He sounded the horn, and the Israelites rallied behind him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they too rallied behind him. He then sent messengers through Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet the Manassites.
Right. So now we have involved some of the northern tribes. Again, a local hero who unites a number of other tribes in a war, blows the shofar. Apropos our study yesterday of blowing the trumpets, the silver trumpets before battle, and how I said I wish it would have felt more authentic had it been a horn, had it been a shofar. Okay, and Scotty, 3640.
And Gideon said to God, if you really intend to deliver Israel through me, as you have said, here I place a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If dew falls only on the fleece and all the ground remains dry, I shall know that you will deliver Israel through me, as you have said. And that is what happened. Early the next day, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me if I speak just once more. Let me make just one more test with the fleece. Let the fleece alone be dry, while there is dew all over the ground. God did so that night. Only the fleece was dry, while there was dew all over the ground.
Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I didn't devote time looking to see, what different commentaries have made of the different symbolism. I'm only going to say that between this story and the business about the broth spilled out before on the altar, just keep it in mind. We're going to want to think of this motif, the motif of agriculture. Again, he's in the threshing floor, and the motif of liquid. Okay, let's push it aside for our next week's study. So another sign, you got to say he's a little bit greedy, this Gideon, right? You think that one sign would have been enough. He wants more and more. And we'll take that into consideration again, as this is the background for the stories of the wars themselves. And this gives us is meant to influence how we read the stories about this character as we go on. And finally, do any of you have any of our Christian fellows here? Were you ever members of the Gideon International Society? Well, then, John, we have to give you the honor here. I will say I look.
11 years. For 11 years, I participated. Local groups are called camps. And we had a camp for our county, and the chief distribution was to motels who agreed to have them placed. 100% of all donations go to the purchase of scripture. All wages and so on are paid out of dues. Also, soldiers are offered free. Students today, basically in private schools, public schools, because of the conflict of state and religion. I ceased the group, although I was happy that it was an interfaith. It's Protestant, not Catholic, but it was interfaith. So you had people coming together. But I didn't find, in my personal knowledge, one non-white person, and I quit the group.
Okay, so thanks for that background. It's hard to find the paragraph I was looking for. I found in Wikipedia, but it doesn't have a citation. Citation needed, and it's interesting because it's quoted all over the internet, but nobody took ownership for it. So I brought the text, the record of a case between the Gideon International and Gideon 300, some sort of a law case. But this was, I felt this was the most authentic document on the internet I could find. So John, if you would read it, and of course, I mean no disrespect to your past involvement.
And Gideon's International was the group that places the Bibles in the hotels.
Okay, go ahead.
They were never. So Gideon was a man.
No, go ahead. Go ahead and read from the beginning. Number 8.
Gideon's is a non-denominational Christian organization, as in Gideon 300, whose activities include distribution of Bibles across the nation and the world. And from a legal, trademark-focused analytical perspective, its members have little or no actual relationship to the biblical character Gideon. They are not farmers, nor are they an army. They do not limit their membership to 300. In fact, the only relationship between the two terms is that the Gideons chose their name to honor their historical figure. You want me to go on to the next paragraph?
Yes, please.
Gideon was a man who was willing to do exactly what God wanted him to do, irrespective of his own judgment as to the plans or results. Humility, faith, and obedience were his great elements of character. This is the standard that the Gideon Association is trying to establish in all its members. Each man to be ready to do God's will at any time, at any place, and in any way that the Holy Spirit leads. The Gideons International Incorporated, History of the Association, visited February 12, 1999. Emphasis in the original. XP3. Apart from the fact that the story of Gideon appears in the Bibles, that the Gideons distribute, none of the goods or services provided by the Gideons directly relate to the historical figure. Nothing wrong with these words. I might say, though, there was a reason there were so few non-white people in the United States. Gideons are in many countries, and some countries are almost 100% black people, and they're members of the Gideons. But one of the requirements is that you be a professional. And due to lots of sociological reasons, we don't have nearly the number of professionals in the non-white percentages of our heritage in this country.
Right. And you also need to be a man.
Yes, yes. And there's an auxiliary for your wives,
right,
if they choose to attend.
Anyway.
How did they define professional?
There were specific, for instance, if you're an officer in the military, you're a professional. If you're not an officer, you're not. If you own a business, you're a professional. If you're if you need a degree or a credential, such as a teacher or a lawyer, you're a professional. They have a long list to explain that if someone's interested in becoming one.
Okay, so I basically just brought this because I've always wondered how they came upon the name Gideon Bible, and I kind of smiled the fact that, and this has nothing to do with the biblical character, but of course it has given when John talks about soldiers in the camps and all that kind of stuff. So just to mention that when you're in Nevada or in Utah, you find the Book of Mormon inside. But what I found interesting is when you're in, and David Friedman knows this, when you're in one of the Gulf states, you find in your next to in that drawer next to your bed, a little prayer rug.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would imagine a Quran. I don't remember the Quran. I remember the prayer rug, but I'm guessing a Quran as well. So
I have one funny story that the lapel pin is a small circle with the jug with the flame coming out of it. I once had it on and was wearing my suit coat, and I actually had it at school, and a girl thought that meant I quit smoking.
there you go.
You-
All right.
Rabbi, yeah, Rabbi, just one quick note that's relevant here. During the Warren Court in the particularly in the 60s, and they were expanding all sorts of civil rights. The Supreme Court case that created the right to a defense counsel if you're indigent is Gideon versus Wainwright, and there's a lot of thought that the court, it was Gideon, Rufus Gideon, who was a prisoner, indigent prisoner in Florida, I think in the Tallahassee area. And he brought the case pro se on his own account, saying, well, I didn't have a lawyer. And everyone thinks that the Supreme Court, like Loving versus Virginia, agreed to review it because it was just the right name for a plaintiff doing justice. So next time you hear about a public defender being appointed, that's Gideon versus Wainwright.
Great. Wonderful, wonderful background, everybody. So Chag Sameach.
Chag
Happy
Sameach.
Pesach, anybody. And we'll see you next week.
Yes.
Oh, you'll see me next week unless I have to go to jury duty. I have to appear on Monday, but I'm just going to leave it. We'll let you know if it's canceled. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.